She stood at the altar trembling, 20 years old, and sold to a beast of an orc to settle her father's debts. Grath of Iron Peak was scarred, silent, and utterly terrifying. She expected a life of brutal captivity in the high wilderness. But on their wedding night, he handed her a wooden box, and what was inside changed everything she thought she knew about monsters. The collapse of the house of Aldous the merchant began not with a roar, but with a whisper behind closed doors. Aldous had been one of the wealthiest traders south of the Greywater, a man whose caravans moved silver and timber across 3 territories. But wealth in the border country was a fragile thing. The clan wars had ended a generation back, and the peace that followed had opened trade routes between orc territory and human lands. Routes that made men like Aldous rich and that could close again without warning. And when the Southern Syndicate defaulted on the silver contracts he had staked everything on, Aldous was not just ruined. He owed 70 gold bars to a consortium of creditors led by Lord Heron, a polished, soft-handed human from the eastern cities who had long looked at Aldous's daughter with calculating eyes. Heron made his terms clear. He would forgive the debt and spare Aldous from the debtor's prison, provided Elira became his wife. It was a trap perfectly laid. Heron did not love her. He wanted a trophy, a beautiful merchant's daughter to add to his collection of things he owned. The night before the papers were to be signed, Aldous sat in his study with his head in his hands, weeping. Elira stood in the doorway, her heart breaking, prepared to sacrifice her life to Heron to save her father. Then, the heavy oak doors shuddered under a massive fist. He had to stoop to enter. An orc, enormous even by the standards of his kind, draped in heavy elk hide that smelled of wood smoke and pine and cold mountain air. His face was a landscape of sun-weathered green skin, dominated by a jagged pale scar that slashed from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from a bear that had not survived their meeting. His tusks were large and yellowed. His eyes, however, were the color of glacial ice, pale, piercing, and terrifyingly calm. He did not wait for permission. He did not wait for the door to be opened properly. Grath walked into the study, his heavy boots tracking snow onto the rug, and the room, which had always seemed large enough, shrank around him the way rooms do when an orc who has spent 30 years alone in the high peaks decides to enter one. He threw a thick stack of documents onto the desk. "I bought your paper, merchant. Every coin you owe to Heron and the Syndicate. I own the deed to this house and your freedom." Aldous stared at him. "Why? What do you want?" Grath's icy gaze shifted slowly to the doorway, pinning Elira to the spot. Elira stopped breathing. This creature was a savage, a ghost story the lowland folk whispered about, the Orc Warlord, who lived alone above the snowline in a hold no human had seen and returned from. He was twice her size, scarred, tusked, and rumored to be violently dangerous. "You cannot," Aldous choked. "She is my daughter. She is promised to Heron." "Heron is a snake who will sell her the moment he tires of her," Grath said flatly. "My terms are simple. She marries me tomorrow at noon. She comes to my hold in the peaks. In exchange, the debt is marked paid, and you keep this house. Refuse and I foreclose by nightfall." Elira looked at her father, broken and weeping, and then at the massive, terrifying orc, who now owned her life. She was terrified of him. She feared his size, his silence, the tusks that gleamed in the lamplight, and the brutal world he came from. Tales of orc warlords dragging brides into the wilderness were horrifyingly common in the lowland taverns, and every one of them ended badly. But as she looked into those pale eyes, she saw no lust in them, no cruel amusement. Only a hard, absolute finality. The look of a man who has decided something and will not be moved from it. And beneath that, Something else. Something she would not recognize until much later. Something that looked, if you knew what you were looking for, like a man trying very hard not to show that he cared. "I will do it," Elira whispered, stepping into the room, her voice trembling but her chin raised. "I will marry you." Grath did not smile. He simply nodded, touched the brim of his snow-crusted fur hood, and said, "Pack warm. We leave immediately after the vows. If this story finds you somewhere warm tonight, do one small thing for me. Write in the comments which town the winter finds you in." Now, back to the peaks. The wedding was a brief sterile affair before a magistrate who kept glancing at Grath as though he expected the orc to eat the furniture. No flowers, no white gown, no music. Elira wore her heaviest wool traveling dress, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold the pen to sign the certificate. Grath stood beside her, a towering monument of silence, smelling of cold air and leather. When the magistrate pronounced them, Grath did not lean in to kiss her. He simply turned, picked up her single trunk as though it weighed nothing at all, and walked out the door. The journey into the mountains was a grueling descent into frozen silence. For 4 days they climbed through snow-choked passes, the wind cutting like a blade. Elira rode behind him, staring at the broad, muscular span of his back, waiting for the moment his brutality would show itself. It never came. When the temperatures plummeted, he gave her his heavy buffalo hide coat and rode in only his wool jacket, his green skin going gray with the cold. At night he set up her cot near the camp stove, boiled water for her tea, and retreated to the far side of the tent to sleep on the frozen ground without a blanket, giving her both. He barely spoke. She asked him once how far they had to go, and he said, 2 days. She asked him if there were bears in these mountains, and he touched the scar on his jaw and said, there were. She asked him nothing else that night. She lay awake, listening to his breathing on the far side of the canvas, slow and steady. The breathing of a man who was not afraid of anything in the dark, and she was sure he was waiting until they were completely isolated to break her. She was wrong about that, but she did not know it yet. On the 5th day, the mountain showed its teeth. They were crossing a narrow wind-scoured ridge with a sheer drop into a ravine. Without warning, a whiteout blizzard slammed into the ridge. The wind blinded them instantly. Her horse panicked, bucked, and Elira was thrown backward, sliding over the edge of the trail. She caught a handful of frozen roots dangling over the abyss, the ice burning her fingers, the wind tearing at her clothes like hands trying to pull her down into the gray void below. She could feel the roots starting to give. She thought of her father. She thought of the warm fire in her father's study. She squeezed her eyes shut and prepared to die. A massive hand locked around her wrist like a vise of iron. Grath had thrown himself flat on the ice, his scarred face inches from hers, and for the first time his pale eyes were not calm. They were blazing. "Look at me," he roared over the wind. "Elira, look at me." She opened her eyes. "I have got you. I am not going to let you fall. Do you hear me? I will not let you fall." With a roar of exertion, he hauled her over the ice and onto the trail and wrapped his arms around her as she collapsed into his chest, sobbing. For a long moment in the raging blizzard he held her, shielding her from the wind with his own body. She could hear his heart pounding beneath the coat. "You are safe," he murmured into her hair, his voice rough and breathless, his arms still locked around her, his whole body between her and the wind. "You are safe." And she believed him, which was the strangest thing of all, because she was clinging to the chest of the creature she had been most afraid of, and for the first time in weeks, she was not afraid at all. They rode double on his horse the rest of the day, and for the first time since he had walked through her father's door, Elira felt something besides fear. A strange, confusing spark of awe. This orc was a beast, yes, but he was a beast that protected what was his. They reached Iron Peak 2 days later, just as the sun was bleeding purple across the jagged peaks. Elira had expected a squalid shack. What she saw made her gasp. A magnificent, sprawling log hold nestled in a sheltered basin between towering pines, built with precision and care. Stone chimneys pushed thick, welcoming smoke into the sky. The windows were solid glass. A massive wraparound porch overlooked a frozen alpine lake. It was not a trapper's hovel. It was a fortress built by someone who intended to stay forever, and who had the hands and the patience and the years of solitude to make it beautiful. The logs were fitted so tight a knife blade would not pass between them. The porch posts were carved, not decorated, just shaped with care. The kind of care a man puts into something when he has nothing else to put his care into. Inside, the hold was warm and impeccably clean. Woven rugs covered the polished floors, and shelves lined with books occupied the walls. It was the home of a reader, a thinker, not the illiterate savage she had imagined. But the warmth could not thaw the ice in her stomach. It was their wedding night. She stood in the great room, trembling, as Grath locked the front door and stoked the fire. He turned to her. The sheer size of him in the enclosed space was overwhelming. "There is hot water in the copper tub in the back room," he said, not meeting her eyes. "You should bathe and get warm. I will tend to the horses." He left her alone for over an hour. When she emerged in her nightgown, clutching a shawl around her shoulders, Grath was sitting in a leather chair by the fire. On the low table between them rested a small, beautifully carved wooden box. He looked up at her, and for the first time she saw a profound exhaustion in his eyes. He did not look at her like property. He looked at her with a heavy, solemn respect. "Sit down, Elira." She sat on the edge of the sofa, knees pressed together. "What is going to happen now?" she whispered. Grath leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I know you are terrified of me. I know you think I bought you to warm my bed and serve my house. Open the box." With trembling fingers, she undid the brass latch. Inside rested a stack of papers and a heavy velvet pouch. She pulled the papers into the firelight. The first document was a deed, not her father's deed. It was the deed to Iron Peak Hold and the surrounding 400 acres of prime timberland. The name on the deed read Elira Aldous Montgomery. Her name. "Turn to the next page," Grath said. She did. It was a ledger and several letters in Lord Heron's handwriting. As her eyes scanned the words, cold horror washed over her. The kind of cold that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with understanding how close you came to a fate you did not see coming. Heron had not merely profited from her father's failure. He had engineered it. Every piece of it. The surveys, the contracts, the timing. Her father had not been unlucky. He had been hunted. He had bribed the surveyors to falsify the silver reports, tricking Algis into investing everything into a dead claim. Worse were letters to a man in the southern ports. Heron had no intention of marrying her. He was planning to sell her to settle his own debts to a brutal underworld lord. The papers fluttered from her numb fingers. "Heron destroyed your father on purpose," Grath said, his voice low. "He laid the trap to get to you. I found out a month ago when one of his couriers got drunk in a tavern and started bragging about the merchant's pretty daughter Heron was going to sell." Elira stared at him. "But why did you step in? You paid 70 gold bars. You gave up a fortune." Grath looked into the fire. 3 years ago, When the fever swept through the lower camps after the clan wars, the border towns cut off all credit for medicine. Your father was the only trader who sent a wagon of supplies down the line. No charge. He saved people who worked my timber contracts. Orcs, humans, half of them veterans of the clan wars who had nowhere else to go after the peace was signed and the old holds were left in ashes. Your father did not ask what color their skin was before he sent the wagon. He looked back at her. I pay my debts, Elira. Your father was a good man who got cornered by a snake. I could not let Heron destroy his family. But you married me. She stammered. You dragged me up here. Grath opened the velvet pouch. Heavy gold coins spilled out, thousands of coins worth. If I had just paid the debt and left you in the lowlands, Heron would have found another way. He owned the local magistrate. The only way to put you completely out of his legal reach was to make you the wife of a man he could not intimidate, in a territory he could not touch. He stood, his massive frame towering over the fire. I did not bring you here to be a prisoner. I brought you here to hide you until the spring thaw. By then, the marshals I hired will have finished investigating the evidence in those letters, and Lord Heron will be in a cell. When the snow melts, you can take the gold, go back to the lowlands, anywhere you want. We can dissolve the marriage. You are free. Elira sat paralyzed, gold coins heavy in her lap. She had spent 2 weeks fearing the beast who had bought her. Now she realized the beast had slain the dragon to set her free, and until the spring, she whispered. Grath walked to the door of the bedroom and rested his hand on the frame. He did not look back. Until the spring, this hold is yours. I will sleep in the stable house. You have nothing to fear from me. Good night, Miss Aldous. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving Elira alone in the warmth of the fire, staring at the wedding gift that had just shattered her entire world. The winter sealed Iron Peak in white. True to his word, Grath banished himself to the drafty stable house. For weeks, Elira saw him only in passing. He chopped wood before dawn, left fresh game on the porch, and disappeared into the tree line. Inside the hold, Elira found herself drowning in silence. She had expected relief at his distance. Instead, she felt a gnawing guilt. She slept in a feather bed by a roaring hearth, while the orc who had given up half his fortune to save her froze in a wooden shack. By late winter, the temperatures dropped to something beyond cold. A deep bone-cracking freeze that made the timber of the hold groan and crack under the weight of it. Elira lay in the feather bed, listening to the wind and thinking about the orc who had given up half his fortune to save her and was now sleeping on a thin blanket in a wooden shack because he had promised not to frighten her. She got up. She wrapped herself in Grath's buffalo coat, which smelled of pine and leather and him, and carried a lantern through the howling wind and unlatched the stable house door. She found him sitting on a thin blanket, his breath pluming, meticulously sharpening a long knife by the dim light of a lamp. He looked up, his pale eyes registering surprise. The fire in the great room is large enough for 2, Mr. Grath, she said, her teeth chattering. I will not have you freeze to death on my property. Something shifted in his rugged green face. He did not argue. He packed up his knife and followed her inside. That night changed everything. They fell into a quiet rhythm. In the evenings, they sat by the fire. She read aloud from his library, surprised at first by its size, and then by its depth. Poetry, history, philosophy. The journals of explorers who had mapped the northern holds before the clan wars burned them empty. She learned that Grath was not merely a warrior. He was a self-educated thinker who had taught himself to read from stolen books in the years after the wars. A man who had chosen the mountains not to escape civilization, but because he found the lowland world hollow and full of people who said things they did not mean. In return, he taught her the arithmetic of frontier survival. how to dress a wound, how to predict a storm by the clouds. And one evening on the porch, the sun going down behind the peaks in colors that had no business being that beautiful, he stood behind her and showed her how to hold a crossbow and align the sights. His massive calloused fingers closed gently over hers on the stock, adjusting her grip, and his chest pressed against her back, warm and solid and vast, and his breath moved her hair, and for a frozen moment, neither of them moved at all. Then he stepped back, clearing his throat, and she missed the warmth of him immediately. And that was when Elira knew that what she felt in her stomach had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with something she had not been prepared for. The scar on his face was not the mark of a monster, it was the badge of a survivor. And she found herself staring at the rugged line of his jaw when he was not looking, wondering things she had never wondered about anyone. But the sanctuary was built on borrowed time. Heron was not a man who accepted defeat. When his spies informed him that the marshals were investigating his ledgers, he panicked. If Elira lived to testify, he would hang. In the middle of a blinding squall, trouble arrived at Iron Peak. 3 men, mercenaries in heavy coats, burst through the front door. The first volley tore through Grath's armchair. Grath kicked over the heavy oak table, pulled Elira behind it, swept the crossbow off the mantel, and tossed the heavy knife into her hands. The front door buckled under a heavy boot, the iron hinges screaming. Grath did not hesitate. He fired twice through the thick oak. A muffled scream echoed from the porch, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the snow. 1 down. The back door leading to the kitchen was kicked open. 2 men in heavy coats swarmed in, swords drawn. One was faster. The blade caught Grath across the shoulder, and he was thrown backward against the hearth, blood blooming across his shirt, the crossbow clattering from his hands. The larger mercenary racked his blade, stepping toward Grath's bleeding form. Heron sends his regards, Orc. He never saw Elira rise from behind the table. She did not scream. She did not close her eyes. She gripped the heavy knife exactly as Grath had taught her and threw it with everything she had. The blade buried itself in the mercenary's shoulder, spinning him sideways. Grath, roaring, lunged from the floor and tackled the last man through the shattered window into the snow. Silence slammed back into the basin. Grath staggered to his feet, clutching his shoulder, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at Elira through the broken window. She was still standing, pale and shaking, her hands empty now, her chest heaving. He stumbled toward the porch and collapsed on the steps. Elira dropped everything and ran to him. "I have got you," she sobbed, hauling his massive weight over her shoulder, and the words were the exact words he had spoken to her on the cliff, and she meant them the exact same way, with the full force of everything she had, aimed at the one person in the world she was not going to lose. "I will not let you fall." The next 48 hours were a battle of a different kind. The bullet from a hidden crossbow bolt had torn through his upper shoulder. The blood loss was severe. Driven by a primal adrenaline she did not know she possessed, Elira tore her linen garments into strips. She boiled water over the roaring hearth, packed the wound with dried yarrow she found in his apothecary jars, pressing down with all her weight to staunch the bleeding. The cabin, once a fortress of quiet, was filled with his strained breathing and the terrifying possibility that she might lose him before she had ever properly found him. For 2 days, Grath drifted in and out of a violent fever. Elira never left his side, sleeping in snatches in a hard chair, waking every hour to bathe his sweating forehead. It was during the darkest hour of the second night that Grath, lost in fever, confessed his truth. "Did not do it for the old man," he mumbled, his massive hand gripping her wrist with shocking strength. "Did it for her." Elira froze. "Saw her outside the trade hall last winter," he whispered. Rich girl, silk dress. But she knelt right down in the freezing mud, gave her own shawl to a crippled miner, ruined the dress. She did not care, knew right then she had a mountain heart, worth more than every silk dress in every lowland city. Elira's breath hitched. She remembered that day, the freezing rain, the shivering old man, the scolding her father had given her for ruining the dress. Too good for those city vultures, Grath choked out. Could not let Heron have her. Had to save her, even if she hates me. Tears spilled down her cheeks, hot and fast, dropping onto the heavy quilt. He had not bought her out of duty to her father's past charity. He had bought her because he had seen her true spirit when she thought no one in the world was paying attention. He had watched a rich girl in a silk dress kneel in the mud for a stranger, and something in that gesture had reached across the distance between the mountains and the lowlands, and found the one part of him he had not succeeded in closing off. He had loved her silently, fiercely, from a distance, without any hope of ever being loved back, and he had planned to bankrupt himself just to set her free. The fever broke on the 4th day. Grath woke to the smell of pine and the sight of Elira asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand clutching his rough fingers. He looked at her and gently squeezed her hand. In the weeks that followed, the air in the hold hummed with undeniable tension. They no longer avoided each other's gaze. When his broad shoulder brushed hers in the narrow kitchen, neither pulled away. And one evening while she was replacing the bandages on his shoulder, his massive hand reached up, his rough, calloused fingers gently cupping her jaw. "You saved my life, Elira," he murmured. "You saved mine first," she whispered back. When the spring thaw came, the outside world breached the basin. A company of mounted marshals crested the ridge. Grath and Elira stood on the porch. The lead rider raised an empty hand in peace, sunlight flashing off a silver badge pinned to his leather vest. Behind him rode 5 armed men and a clerk with a satchel of documents. "Put the crossbow away, Grath. I bring good news." The marshals sat at their rebuilt table and laid out the aftermath. The syndicate ledgers Grath had provided were devastating. Lord Heron had been arrested attempting to flee south. He faced 20 years for fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder. "Your father's name is entirely cleared, Miss Aldous," the marshal said. "His trade routes have been reinstated. He is a free, prosperous man again." He cleared his throat. "Given the duress under which the union was formed, a magistrate is prepared to sign an immediate dissolution. You are free to return to the lowlands." Grath stood rigidly by the fireplace, staring into cold, dead ashes, his massive hands hanging at his sides, his scarred jaw clenched so tight the muscles stood out like cords. He had packed her trunk before dawn. He had folded her things with the same mechanical care he had shown her on the mountain trail, precise, gentle, and utterly devoid of any expression that might have told her what it was costing him. He was keeping his word. He was a man of his word. And being a man of his word was going to destroy him. And he was going to let it, because that was the kind of man he was. "Thank you, Marshal," Elira said quietly. "Could you give us a moment?" The door shut. Elira turned to Grath. He refused to look at her. "Your trunk is by the door," he said, his voice tight. "The dissolution papers are on the table. The pass is clear. You can be back in your father's house by next week." Elira walked slowly across the wide plank floor, stopping inches from his broad chest. "Is that truly what you want, Grath? You want me to go?" His jaw clenched. "I promised you your freedom. I'm a man of my word. You were born for comfort and society, not chopping firewood and surviving attacks in the snow. You stubborn fool. she whispered, and the words came out fierce and tender and exasperated all at once. The way words come out when you have spent months watching someone try to give you up, and you have finally run out of patience for the nobility of it. Grath finally looked down at her, his pale, icy eyes wide, and for the first time since she had known him, the stoic mask cracked, and underneath it was not stone at all, but a man who had been alone so long he had forgotten that wanting something was allowed. Elira reached over to the table. She picked up the dissolution papers, walked to the hearth, and threw them into the fire. She watched them curl and blacken and turn to ash, and she felt nothing but certainty, the clearest she had felt since the night her father's study door had shaken under a massive fist. "I do not want the gold," she said, stepping into his space, her eyes blazing. "And I certainly do not want the lowlands. I want the man who stood between me and the edge of a cliff and told me he would not let me fall. I want the man who took a blade for me and bled on his own floor rather than let anyone touch me. I want the man who saw me kneel in the mud for a stranger and decided I was worth 70 gold bars and a fortress in the sky. I want my husband." Grath's stoic mask shattered. With a ragged exhale that sounded almost like a sob, the sound of a man who has been holding something in for 30 years and has just been told he can stop, he reached out and pulled her against his chest, lifting her clean off her feet. His arms went around her with a tenderness that should have been impossible from someone his size, and she felt his heart hammering against her cheek, and it was the same wild pounding she had felt through his coat on the cliff that day. The heartbeat of a man who is terrified not of dying, but of losing. He held her with a consuming tenderness that had nothing to do with his size and everything to do with the years he had spent alone in these mountains, telling himself he did not need anyone. "Iron Peak is my home," she murmured against his chest, her voice steady now. The steadiest it had been since the day she signed the marriage certificate, with shaking hands in a magistrate's office that smelled of ink and fear. "And so are you." He held her, and the fire crackled, and the mountains stood outside the windows the way they had stood for 10,000 years, patient and indifferent to everything except the fact that two people had finally stopped being afraid of each other. Outside, the snow was melting. The alpine lake below the porch was showing its first blue through the ice. The pines were starting to smell like spring. And Iron Peak Hold, which had been one man's fortress of solitude for 30 years, had become something else entirely, not because the walls had changed, but because the person inside them had. And that was enough. If this story stayed with you, tell me one thing in the comments. When Grath confessed in the fever that he had loved her since the day she knelt in the mud for a stranger, what do you think it cost him to say it out loud? I read every comment. And if you want more tales from the peaks, subscribe, because the hearth here always keeps a cup for you.